Hello, my name's Howard Chu. I'm Save the Children's Australian Policy and Advocacy Lead, and I'm very pleased to introduce this case study about advocating for children's rights in the climate crisis.
Howard, could you tell me what your tool is about?
This tool is a written case study that describes Save the Children's successful advocacy to highlight the impact of the climate crisis on children's rights in Australia, using the United Nations Universal Periodic Review, or the UPR, process which culminated in 2021. The UPR is a regular 5-year review process in which the human rights record of every United Nations member state is reviewed by its peers, who can make recommendations for improvement. In this case, it was Australia being reviewed and children's rights were a major focus.
How does this case study contribute to advancing children's rights, and in particular children's right to a healthy and sustainable environment?
The case study provides a guide for civil society actors who wish to influence national policymakers to take children's rights seriously, including by acting on climate change and listening to children. And in particular, it describes how to use the UPR mechanism, going into practical detail about steps to follow and tips along the way.
How can the case study inspire other civil society practitioners?
I hope the case study shows that human rights mechanisms can be a powerful way to create positive change for children's rights and on climate change, and also that currently underutilised processes such as the UPR have a real potential to encourage changes in national policy.
What are the key steps you've undertaken to influence Universal Periodic Review recommendations on children's rights and the environment and climate change?
The key objective of this advocacy was to persuade other member states or countries to make recommendations to Australia about better fulfilling children's rights, listening to children and acting on climate change. And this was because we believe that if a number of countries made those recommendations, that would increase pressure on the Australian government to act. So I'll briefly summarise the advocacy process that we followed, and the case study document goes into this in a lot more detail. But in summary, we started by analysing the child rights landscape in Australia, and that identified climate change as a priority for children's rights. That was then translated into specific recommendations that we hoped that other countries would make to Australia. And importantly, we worked in coalition with around 200 other non-government organisations in Australia to highlight deficiencies in Australia's human rights performance, including on climate change. So the advocacy that Save the Children did on children's rights and climate change in particular was part of a much larger coalition piece of work that was undertaken across Australian civil society. The key advocacy work that we did, apart from the work directed at the Australian government itself, was to meet with representatives of other countries. So those were typically missions and embassies to Australia based in Australia. And in those meetings, we described the child rights situation in Australia, talked about the key deficiencies, and highlighted the recommendations that they could most usefully make to the Australian government, including about climate change. The key moment was then Australia's appearance before the Human Rights Council in January 2021, which is where those other countries made their recommendations to Australia about improvements in Australia's human rights record. A large number of those recommendations were about children's rights, and in particular, there were 8 recommendations that other countries made about climate change, including some that were specifically in reference to climate change and children, which was a very successful outcome. And one way of measuring that is by comparing that to Australia's previous review 5 years previously, where there were 0 recommendations made to Australia about climate change. Following that appearance in January 2021, the Australian government again appeared before the Human Rights Council in July of 2021, where it responded to the recommendations. And since then, we've had an ongoing process of following up with the Australian government, both to ensure there's accountability for the recommendations they've accepted and to continue to seek to persuade them to adopt the recommendations that they rejected.
What were your main challenges?
The key challenge is that many decision makers don't think of climate change as a human rights issue at all. And for example, the Australian government has resisted acknowledging that climate change is covered by the Convention on the Rights of the Child, despite clear statements by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child that it is. And of course, that's one of the things that we're trying to change through our advocacy.
What would be your top 3 tips you'd like to give to other civil society practitioners, including children's human rights defenders, wishing to use the Universal Periodic Review procedure to report on the effects of environmental harm, including climate change, on children's rights in their country?
First, be clear, realistic, and focused about what you're trying to achieve. Take the time to develop specific recommendations that you want other states to make to the country under review, and be consistent in how you advocate for them. Second, work in coalitions with other NGOs wherever possible. Put in the time to build strong relationships and ensure everyone has a shared strategy and key messages. Many voices are better than one, but only when they're all saying the same thing. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, stay optimistic. The scale of the problem of climate change is enormous, but it's far from hopeless. Children are leading on the issue of climate change, most visibly through the global Fridays for Future and School Strikes for Climate movement. Their leadership has been galvanising in focusing the public and governments on both climate change and on children's rights and the importance of children's rights. There are many tools available to us to address the climate crisis. Human rights mechanisms like the UPR are a powerful example.